Okay, Chapter 9, Anarchy and Hate on the World Wide Web. As you see, I'm wearing my glasses, so I look a lot smarter. So hopefully this chapter will be more cognitive in value. All right. So 9.1, legally define a hate crime, describe how white supremacist groups use the internet, explain the relationship between left-wing groups and special interest or single-issue interest groups. We're going to look at ALF, and provide a couple of examples of recent activities and describe some of the techniques that right-wing hate groups use to spread their propaganda. Discuss the primary issues associated with the U.S. Patriot Act. And then we're going to explain the conflicting roles and activities observed within law enforcement when they're investigating things that are considered to be intelligence. All right, so both technologies, the printing press and the internet, they always equate them as kind of the disruptor of their era. They revolutionized the way the world was able to process information and communication. And again, if you own the narrative, if you can own the communication, you can sway a population pretty easily. Anytime that someone has centralized information is dangerous. Where decentralized, it takes a lot more to confuse or conflate the narrative or the issue. Whereas if I have a central set of information, I can adjust that very quickly. And then we've seen how this has moved on to the web, this centralized information kind of scheme with social media, where people are focused on a single place or means of communication. Hate crimes have a unique impact on victims. They're ideological, one. They're particularly vicious, two. And they are seen by the offender as the right thing to do, and the defender as being victimized, etc. It's not so much we're going to go out and just beat up everybody. Well, we're going to beat up just certain people because we have the physical right to do that. Mostly the cops are not trained really well to handle these crimes. We do our basic gang training. We do hate crime training, but you don't get a lot of training when it comes to the digital hate, understanding how the underpinnings or the motivations of people are kind of forced down a track. This is left for your specialized units, and a lot of times you have departments or agencies that don't have those specialized units, which again is a problem. Hate crime is defined as a criminal offense against persons, property, or society that is motivated in whole or part by an offender's bias against the individual's group, perceived race, religion, ethnic, national origin, gender, age, disability, or sexual orientation. Most of your states have added to this new provisions or more provisions to make the use of hate speech, hate actions a lot less desirable for the offender. So in that choice theory, the law has tried to create a mechanism that is so painful that nobody wants to get caught doing a hate crime. White supremacist groups, known as right-wing extremist groups, represent a movement that promotes white power. The groups are ideological. Take back America, get rid of all the immigrants, typically along those lines there. They work in small cells. They can be very overt, but they can also be very clandestine in their activities. The internet is the perfect place for them to put their message, because they can put out a very palatable message online that when people go to research and they go, well, they do have a point, and that's a very dangerous thing when you can twist the narrative where people think, oh, well, there might be a point here, because that's what leads you down that kind of slippery slope to radicalization. Organizations out on the web, Stormfront, New Saxon, ethnic cleansing, hate video games, things such as that. The unfortunate thing is when you start looking at video games and you really start getting into that, just about every video game out there has some form of hate in it. You're killing somebody for some reason, so kind of is what it is. I'm not a big believer of the desensitization or desensitizing of the population by just video games. I think there's a lot more things that go into it, but it certainly helps get people down the wrong road. Left-wing extremists, seen a resurgence in the anarchist groups. These are including the Anarchist International, which has dramatically increased since September 11th. Anarchist groups are associated with Anarchist International has seen a real growth in their population. So when you're looking across the far left wing genre with the politics that are going on, you're seeing a much greater vocal presence than you did before. Black bloc rallies. There are a lot of groups that align or associate with an anti, white power message, or an anti-government message, or an anti-policy like eco-terrorism message. Extreme left movements are observed in modern society through eco-terrorism. There was a while that people were getting their Humvees blown up because they drove Humvees, and people saw that as a threat against the world, threat against the people, and therefore they saw that as something they had to take on, and they didn't see anybody helping from the government, so they went in and they would attack, be very violent, very ideological on people that were driving big cars, wearing coats that were not made of fur but looked like fur. They saw that as an affront as well. We refer a lot of times, we call them special interest groups. I'm not sure if that's a great term, because special interest groups, there are lots of interest groups out there that do a really good job and are very focused on providing a public good. But there certainly are special interest groups that go too far. Sometimes they call them the single issue extremist groups. ALF, which is in Great Britain, in the mid-70s, ALF committed abuse and exploitation, or was committed, to the ending of abuse of animals, and they were very, very aggressive. The members engaged in direction against those who utilize animals for research. They would harm doctors, medical staff. They would firebomb laboratories. Very, very aggressive, very in-your-face group of people. And there was a sting that went on, Operation Backfire, which was able to take down quite a large ring of these individuals. ELF, Earth First, group came from ALF, kind of some of the beginnings of ALF, but they were different. Okay, ALF or ELF focused on the environment, but they watched what was going on with ALF in the 70s, and when they started up in the 80s, they followed a lot of the playbook that ALF used. So ALF stepped forward and was very aggressive. They would do things such as put explosive on trees, so the woodsman would go in to try to cut a tree down, end up, hurting, either getting blown up, hurting themselves. they would do all kinds of extreme kind of methods to prevent people from being able to, uh, you know, cut down trees or build on certain land, things such as that, pollute water. So they were very aggressive, very um, they believed very much in their cause, but the way they went about getting others to join their cause or believe in what they wanted was not right. Uh, they took it too far, and it's okay in America to have an extremist view, and you can um, believe what you want. You know, no one can tell you what to believe and what not to believe. But when you start taking actions and you start, propagating that onto others, then you have an issue, and that's something that we as law enforcement are always looking for is those groups that take it to the next step. Go beyond the thoughtful, kind of the thoughts and things, and put more things into action where they can actually harm somebody. And action can also be the spreading of a hate message or misinformation. Domestic terrorists, uh, I mean, we live in the 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 era of domestic terrorism. I mean, we have ISIS, we have all kinds of other groups, Al Qaeda, and other organizations that are bent on uh, taking down our way of life. Um, these extremist organizations recruit heavily online. They use the internet as their medium of communication. They use the internet as a way of recruiting and enticing and enabling those followers and those members into their organizations. They use news groups and post boards, um, email, all your normal stuff. But social media is typically the place where people will really let their hair down and be very vocal and very honest in their writings. It's kind of the nature of social media. I get to say what I want to say. I don't have to worry about what people think. It's my right to speak and say what I want to say. Well, you still run that issue that if you walk into a theater and you yell fire and everybody runs out and someone gets hurt running out and there's no fire, you're just making it up, you're still responsible for the injury of that person. And that association has to be made, especially when social media is being used to manipulate or guide uh, groups of people to do negative things against other people. Domestic terrorists, they seek to dehumanize, desensitize, the consumer towards violence. They use computer games. They use other methods of making themselves seem like the right people. If you ever watched an ISIS recruiting video, it is Clattering Swords is one of their promotional videos, and it's well done. It's a production Hollywood style movie that shows ISIS, and they're running across the desert with their black flags, and they're taking on the demons and the capitalists and all the bad folks in the world. But it's a great propaganda. They use Border Patrol. Look at how much play in the Middle East that the Border Patrol incidents that have happened recently are exaggerated beyond what they are. There's some tragic consequences on the border, but then these are exaggerated by groups. Ethnic cleansing is something that is very popular in the social media groups. The Jewish conspiracy against Americans and against the capitalist society. Racist music. Memes. And memes are probably the most destructive of all of the means of communication, because when you look at a cartoon, you don't go, I don't want to look at that. You look at it and your brain goes, oh, okay, I understand that, and it ingests that picture as it is. So pictures are very powerful, And you'll notice that when people are trying to get their point across, especially on social media, things like that, they will publish memes because memes are much more effective in getting their message across than communication or texting or writing something. Internet cartoons, again, as memes, widely distributed propaganda showing Jewish folk or Jewish people as rats. Um, Extremist groups do a lot of their own internal videos. Um, when you are talking about memes and things such as that, those are instantaneous pictures that your brain picks up and it sees, and it automatically associates that. Whereas a video takes a little longer. If I can make a video cartoon, it's even better. Because now I have entertainment. Because cartoons, even though they might be really bad, they're still cartoons, and so they're seen with some type of humor, some other things that we associate with childhood come out in these cartoons. So memes and internet cartoons are very dangerous, and they're used skillfully actually by a lot of these extremist organizations that are trying to get a narrative or message. And remember, all of this is talking about getting a message across. I need to tell you how to think. I want you to think like I do, so we can go and take on whatever enemy or foe that I deem is bad for us. The internet, again, we've talked about this in other sessions. It's a great place to disseminate your message. Doesn't cost you anything. We can share information through archival services like YouTube or OneDrive or Dropbox. I can put up my websites. I can tell you how to do something. I can put out my newsletter, which you're going to read and follow the things that I want you to follow. ISIS actually has a newsletter, and we would get the newsletter, and it's a very well done publication. It's looked like Wired magazine or any other magazine, but they're talking about all of the things that the Western society has done bad, and it puts things in there such as how to build this bomb, how to destroy or how to shoot or how to kill, how to stab. Has all these articles in there about stuff, but it also has all the political articles by people that send in articles and publish inside of this newsletter, this ISIS newsletter. And that's been going on since I think the first issue that I ever got was back in 2006, 2007. Most dangerous action on the extremist websites is when they put out your personal information, okay, your PII. So if I can put out your address, date of birth, social security number, where you work, and then I encourage other people to join in a phone campaign at your work and tell them what a bad person you are, then you're using tools on the internet to cause harm to that person. I know of a couple of folks that had their names put out on child pornography websites, and it would say, "Hey, Bob Smith is a child predator, and he lives in your community, and here's his phone number, and you should call him." Doesn't mean that he actually was, just that they got a message saying he was. So, of course, the community raised up, was very upset. Started calling him and caused this individual caused that or an individual that I'm exempling of a lot of harm, cost him his job. He ended up having to move from the community, but the stigma of that basically followed him to his next residence, which was unfortunate. Fundraising done on the internet. We've talked about this again, yet another slide set, using GoFundMe pages, using donation sites, selling sermons, articles, music, things such as that. getting people ordained online is a very easy way of getting someone into a jail so they can have a private communication with maybe someone that they shouldn't be having communication with. So if I go online and I get ordained in one of the online churches and then I register with my state, I am, I'm a pastor or a reverend for that church, and the state can't say I'm not. The state has no recourse to say that I'm not. I just have to have the things around me that kind of allude with my being a pastor or a priest or someone else. So if I have a website that is promoting certain things, I'm a preacher of those things. Selling my books, selling my sermons, selling my articles becomes very easy at that point. So now I have a website that has a WooCommerce function on it, and I sell through my store. And then all these donations, they all come in and fund my extremist organization or viewpoint. The Patriot Act, we talked a little bit about Patriot Act earlier on, but the emergence of the domestic groups and the radical extremist political thoughts, these are all protected under the First Amendment. I can have my viewpoint. You can't tell me what I can and cannot say as long as I'm not causing harm when I say it or believe it. So if I believe something, you can't arrest me for believing that. Okay. When I act out or do something stupid, yes, you can. But if I'm sitting in a coffee shop and me and another person are having a conversation about white supremacy or blowing up Humvees, something like that, yeah, those are indicators. And sure, a police officer could talk to me, but they couldn't arrest me for my speech because I have the right to talk about those things. I'm not doing anything other than offering my thoughts, and those thoughts could be completely fictitious. I might just be spewing to spew. So that's one of the problems with the First Amendment is that the First Amendment, it creates the free society that we're in, and with that freedom comes a lot of risk, and we have to. I think we do a good job of managing that risk, but it's still, the more freedom you have, the more risk you have for your society. So the U.S. Intelligence Agency, these were created back, pre-World War I, especially in the communication side. And the CIA, NSA, DIA, they're all foreign intelligence agencies. They're all outside agencies. They're not supposed to be looking on the inside. And we found over the last few years, with some of the leaks and things that have happened, that CIA lost its kind of vision a little bit. The NSA lost its vision a little bit, and was looking inside probably more than they were looking outside, and that became a problem that was fixed. The FBI is actually responsible for domestic terrorism, domestic intelligence, domestic issues, and they're the ones that are supposed to be doing that work. Investigative policing, intelligence policing, it's reactive in nature. We don't proactively go out and investigate. We have to wait for something to happen for us to investigate. And that usually is true of any government organization that is working cases. You're a proactive investigator, or excuse me, a reactive investigator. Domestic intelligence, its primary concern is the protection of civil liberties and constitutional rights within the United States. That's why the FBI is always involved in these cases. If something bad happens, where they come in and they say, here's the FBI, they're going to investigate this hate crime, because it's their purview, it's their jurisdiction, it's their responsibility to go in and look at these cases. So domestic intelligence, FBI, external intelligence, DIA, NSA, CIA. Conflicting roles. As you can see there in the middle, mostly work outside. Agents have no arrest powers. Activities are proactive in nature. Where law enforcement is reactive in nature, the CIA is proactive in nature. So they are going to go in, they're going to actively look for things in your community or in your, and that might be intrusive to some Americans' rights, because you do have the right to be protected from the United States government. The FBI is, again, more restricted, and they are more reactive in their processing. Unless something puts them on a track, they're not going to develop a new lead from kind of a thin air, where the CIA will develop new leads from less credible sources that might lead to something credible. The funny thing is, alludes to it down in the bottom bullet, one of the funny things is the FBI and the other agencies don't talk to each other. They have no communication amongst one another. And there's people kind of laugh quite a bit about how the federal government can't talk amongst itself, and they definitely don't talk to law or local law enforcement. So you have all these kind of stovepiped organizations that communicate within themselves but don't reach out to each other. And if they do reach out to each other, it's to get information from someone else. They're not going to give information back. I mean, that happens entirely too much. So intelligence can be defined as information which has been identified as relevant, collected, and verified. Raw data must be collected, scrutinized, and processed, and the product is more intelligible, accurate, and usable. So, give you an example of this, so it makes sense. I can get call detail records. I get the spreadsheet just full of all these different numbers and calls and types of calls. And what I do is I run that through software that then breaks that down and tells me that I have 27 outgoing calls, 27 incoming calls, I have 15 text messages, and here's the text of those text messages. Okay, so I processed that raw data. Raw data comes in, it's just a big data dump on an Excel spreadsheet, but once I have processed it, now I have information that I might be able to use in a more timely manner. September 11, it really opened our eyes to some weaknesses we had in the United States. It was very bureaucratic or neurotic in a way. We had a lot of problems. There was no central agency. DHS didn't exist. So there was no one managing all of the individuals. There was very over-restrictive guidelines, and this is where DHS came from. DHS was created to bring all of these agencies together so they could all talk. They could all provide information to one another. And since DHS has come up, things have gotten better, but they still don't talk to local law enforcement, and that's a bad thing. The Patriot Act of 2001 expanded basically 4 traditional tools that we talked about: your wiretap, search warrants, tap and trace, and your court orders and subpoenas. It expanded them dramatically, reduced the bar of expectation, or reduced the bar of issuance. So courts didn't need as much information to issue a subpoena or warrant under a Patriot Act request as they did prior to that. It was easier to get a search warrant or a warrant by tagging everything with the word terrorism. And it became abused. The same reason Apple didn't want to give out its secret code is because once you give it to law enforcement, there's a good potential based on history, that it's going to be used incorrectly and it will be abused. The Patriot Act in 2006 was reauthorized. Wiretap provisions were maintained, but they really put a lot more review on those powers. You didn't have just these blanket tap and trace rules anymore. You actually had to have a lot more in your affidavit to get a tap and trace. Provision of library records was removed, the exception of electronic communications through the library. Sneak and peek was changed to limit the time search that could be conducted. These are all different types of searches that were done. Ability to conduct surveillance against lone wolf terrorists, which is the greatest threat we have in terrorism, when someone gets radicalized by themselves. They don't have a group, they don't go to meetings, they just decide to do something on their own. And the definition of terrorism was changed, and it was expanded to include what we would consider to be traditional crimes. And the line between terrorism and crime really got blurred. And it still is blurred. It's just like we have the computer crimes and cyber terrorism. It's blurry in a lot of places because they are the same thing in most cases. So when you're looking at that cyber terrorism, you're looking at our computer crime, you look at it and say, well, I can get a whole lot more if I use the word cyber terrorism than I can if I use computer crime. And now people are using the word cyber terrorism for everything. It's just another one of the new words on the street. Roving wiretaps in relation to foreign intelligence collection was reauthorized. So we could tap and trace outside the United States without much excuse. Reauthorization was extended to business records and tangible things. So I can still collect, cell phone tower data. I can still collect things that would be considered printouts and billings, account information, things that would be considered business records. I could still get, and again, the lone wolf provision was extended, and it was also expanded to include monitoring and some other things that may be considered intrusive or close to the line on constitutional protection in the United States. But this is something that you have to remember. We as a society are the ones that grant all these permissions and authorizations. So when we as a society say it's okay, we would rather have a little bit more intrusive investigation, and we're willing to give up some of our freedom for that. Well, then the society chooses to allow these provisions to be expanded upon. If the society revolts and comes back and says, no, 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 we're not going to have the government doing that kind of stuff, and there's enough of a call, then the government, tightens itself up and says, okay, maybe we stepped out too far and we'll back off. So it really comes down to, you and me guiding law enforcement in the constitutional thing. Some feel the act has gone too far. Some feel it hasn't gone far enough. I've got some friends that are very pro, or they're law enforcement, they're very pro Patriot Act, they're very pro cyber terrorism. They absolutely feel that you shouldn't have any right when it comes to a terrorist investigation. The greater good is to take away your rights regardless. Then you have the left, where you have a much and I have a couple of friends that are very pro-constitutional. They would rather see a terrorist act than the rights of people be taken away. I remember a judge telling me one time, he said, I would rather make 11 mistakes and let 11 felons free than put one innocent person in jail. And I thought at the time, I was like, oh, that's kind of stupid. And then the more I thought about it, he's right. I would rather make some mistakes and let a felon go and catch him on another day than take the rights of a free person and take their rights away from him and put him in jail mistakenly. So I guess as you get older, you look back and you start looking at certain things. And I'm starting to see, especially now we're releasing so many people from jail with DNA tests and all this other stuff, just that there are so many flaws in our law enforcement system that making a clear, discernible yes and no is tough sometimes. Sometimes it's absolutely right on, but sometimes it's tough. There's been some circumstantial cases that people have gone to jail and later on been let out because the case was so circumstantial that evidence came out to prove them innocent. All right, so this has been Chapter 9, Anarchy and Hate. This is a really tough subject because people fall in different spectrums. Students will fall in different spectrums. Some people will lean one way and some people will lean another way. And when you start talking about, especially in today's non-confrontational world where you can't say anything without offending somebody, having conversations about anarchy and hate and things such as that is a real tough conversation to have because people are so polarized in their feeling. And then you have the center, which is trying to understand the left and the right and kind of put it all together. And that, fortunately, group of people is growing, and the super polarized left and right are starting to dwindle a little bit. And so there is hope, and there is a positive there. All right, so this was chapter 9, and I will see you again in the next slide set.